is Bean to Barstool, a podcast that looks at the intersections of craft beer and craft chocolate. My name is David Nilsson. I'm a professional beer writer and an advanced cicerone, and the creator and host of this show. The music for this episode is by my dear friend, indie folk musician Anna P.S. You can find out more about Anna's music in the show notes or at her website, annapsmusic.com. You can find links and information about our guests in the show notes as well. I hope you enjoy this episode of Bean to Barstool. Hey everyone, this is David. Thanks for listening to the Bean to Barstool podcast. Enjoy. I spent my early years in a rundown trailer park in northern Indiana, in the buckle of the Rust Belt. It was hemmed in on three sides by swamps, and the other kids and I would roam around them in feral packs, learning more about the wildness and cruelty of childhood than that of nature. When I was 7, we moved to the Atlantic coast of southern Florida, into a brick ranch house identical to every other on our anonymous suburban side street, that in turn was nearly identical to the streets on either side, and so forth through the neighborhoods until the rhythm was broken by water, or a highway, or a shopping center, and then continued on again on the other side. The wildlife was more exotic to my Midwestern eyes than what I'd grown up around, and so earned a wider berth. But children are the same everywhere, and the year I spent there was not all that different from my years in the Hoosier State. We moved to Ohio, to the county I've lived in ever since, when I was 8. Florida stayed lodged in my mind as a green, humid fever dream of plastic consumerism and wild wonder. New construction taking space beside an antediluvian natural landscape. Florida, as a land, was beautiful. What was built on top of it felt like it was borrowing time from an ecosystem that would someday reclaim it. Today we're going to talk to a chocolate maker from the other side and the other end of the Sunshine State. Sara Ratza followed her own wandering path to her eventual home, and her story begins, as mine did, in Indiana. Sara loves plants, and she incorporates the bounty of the natural world into her bars, and recognizes cacao itself as a plant that will give its best gifts when it is respected as a part of the natural order. There is wildness in Sara's chocolate bars, and it's a wildness that can teach us about our relationship to botanical ingredients humans have been using since long before we started building shopping malls on top of swamps. Some of those ingredients can help us resist illness, some can improve our sex lives, some give us energy or warm our souls as much as our bodies. All of them offer a fascinating sensory window into the wild spaces around us. Sara Ratza took a roundabout path to opening her chocolate shop in Tarpon Springs, Florida. She went to college in Indiana, lived in New York City for a time, and then moved to Florida to be nearer to family. As a college student, she fell in love with craft beer, and I found out about her chocolate after seeing she had made a bar infused with hops used in brewing. When Sara and I talked recently, our mutual love for beer seemed like a natural place for our conversation to begin. So you went to college then, you said, at IU, is that right?
I did. I said, I'm a Hoosier.
Well, I was born in Indiana. I was born up in Warsaw.
So you're officially a Hoosier as well.
Technically, I've been here 30 years, so I feel like Ohio has claimed me, but technically, yes.
I understand.
So there in Bloomington, what do you have there? Upland Brewing and a couple other good breweries?
Oh my gosh. Well, at the time, yeah. I mean, I graduated in 2002. I'm showing my age. So yeah, Upland Brewing was there at the time. And honestly, I didn't visit the breweries necessarily. What really found my passion for craft beer was I found this little pub with my friend at the time, and they did the around the world beer, and you got the little stamps on your card, and I went with my friend and we would just try all the different beers, and I think that's where my passion really started for the flavors of beer.
And that was before really the explosion of craft beer. It was still kind of an outsider's thing.
Yes. Yeah. So I think it's funny though, because as I've gotten older and as I've aged, I've found that the people that I've gravitated towards, obviously, are other people that like craft beer. So, when we go out, it's not the type of thing like, hey, let's go have a Budweiser. Right. It's always like, hey, let's go to the brewery, or this place has good beers on tap. So
sure. Do you remember any particular favorites from back then?
Oh my gosh. Well, I've always tend to be like a Hefeweizen girl. I've always
Sure.
liked the citrus with the hops and the hazies. And I think when I was younger, I found a beer, Franziskaner.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was when I was young, that was kind of the one I always like, if I could find it, I'm like, that's the one I want. And then when I went to Europe, I went to Germany and Austria, and I remember seeing it there and actually having like the European labels and just being like, oh my gosh, this is my favorite. So, but now obviously as the craft beer explosion has happened, and I mean, I'm blessed. Where I live, we have 43
Yeah.
breweries in my county.
Yeah.
So in my little teeny town, we have 5 breweries. So it is so nice to be able to have people locally making really good beer. I mean, there's so much to choose
Yeah.
from. So
Tampa's
yeah,
got some fantastic breweries. I
yes,
had a
we
friend
do.
who lived down there for a couple years, and he would bring beer back from like Green Bench and
Yeah,
Coppertail and a couple others. That
yeah,
was
oh
always really
yeah.
good.
We have a
So
new brewery that just opened up down. I can walk from my shop, and they recently paired my nibs with their beer. So, and
nice.
they're doing really amazing things. So it's really nice, especially, you know, I don't want to leave my town all the time to go get beer. And
Hmm.
so now I'm all like, I'm in trouble because now I have someplace easy to go get beer.
Yeah,
So good beer. So
sure.
yeah.
Let's talk briefly about the hopped bar and your relation. We talked a little bit about your relationship to craft beer, but
Yeah.
how did you bring that into the chocolate making process? How did that bar come about?
Oh my gosh. Well, my husband and I both really love hops, and hops is such a really special plant. Most beer people know that hops is a cousin to cannabis, and the energetic effects of hops to people are really similar. It's actually used as a nervine. So when you're helping people with herbs, you actually, you could take hops and steep it in water and get that same calming effect that it will give you when you're drinking beer. So naturally, when you're steeping hops and when you're steeping hops in alcohol, that creates a tincture whenever you're in the herbalism world. And so the actual medicine making of hops is known to be a sedative. It is going to help relax people. I mean, all the things that we know whenever we drink beer, all of those effects come from hops. So the flavor to me, like my husband and I will just drink hops tea because we love the flavor. But for me, with the chocolate, hops and citrus have always been some of my favorite combinations together. And obviously, like when we're drinking beer, a lot of people like the chocolate beer as well, which again, we have the hops and the citrus and
Mhm.
all of those fantastic flavors that go in it. So it was just natural for me. Like, you know, I'm going through my apothecary and like, that's friendly, that's a good one. You know, a lot of people aren't going to want like valerian in their when they're chocolate. So hops is just a natural combination to me.
Sure. What variety of hops do you use in your hopped bar?
Well, it's interesting. And my husband and I talk about this all the time because my husband and I both love Citra. And I actually really like Galaxy hops also. But when I purchase my hops, I actually purchase from an herbal company.
Hmm.
So they don't label what kind of hops they are.
Oh,
So I find that, and this is what's so interesting too, is when you're going through beer companies, the beer manufacturing companies that sell hops, of course, always label what kind of hops they are.
right.
But in the herbal world, doesn't matter.
They're probably
So
not worried as much about aroma as
no,
just the effect.
no,
Yeah.
yep, just the effect of it. So when I went to an herbal conference a couple years ago, and there was a young lady who came from Oregon, and she was from Bastyr School, and she brought with her a humongous jar of hops that she had grown and brought herself, and they were the most beautiful hops I had ever seen. It's interesting how like in the beer world it's important and in the herbal world not important.
That's kind of true in reverse with beers made with chocolate. A lot of
Mm,
times your brewers don't know where the cacao
uh-huh.
is from,
Yep.
but in the chocolate side, obviously, that's extremely important. What is your
Yeah. So
process for that bar? Do you put actual hop petals in it?
I do. I actually infuse all of my bars with the actual plant. So, and obviously, when you're making chocolate, you can't put any kind of liquid in your chocolate in the machine because it makes it seize. So, I found just the easiest way to get flavor from plant material is through actually putting the plant into the bar. So, that's just been my, until I can make large batches and eventually I'll get to that point where I can make a whole batch in the grinder with just like hops. I just put it directly in. I don't know. I love the flavor of just putting, I love plants anyway. So just putting it directly
Sure.
into the chocolate is what
Yeah.
works for me.
You mentioned there was a brewery there that has used some of your nibs. Tell me a little bit
Yes.
about that collaboration or any others like it.
Oh my gosh. So they made an imperial stout with the nibs that that I've given them were from Belize. They are the Moho Valley Maya Mountain farm. That is the base chocolate I use for all of my bars, mainly because I find it to be the most user friendly. So it has a little bit of like the sweeter fruity notes to it. It has more of that mocha that like the average person is going to taste, and it has a natural sweetness to it. So that's the nib that I gave them. And so they did two different flavors. They did one that incorporated peanut, and it was the chocolate and peanut. And then they made another that incorporated the vanilla and the coffee and the nibs in
Awesome.
it.
Which brewery
So
was that?
so that is called Brighter Days Brewery, which is in downtown Tarpon Springs. They had just opened probably like right around the same time, so they kind of sat through this pandemic, and as soon as they were able to open their doors, they did. So
That's
really
awesome.
weird times we're opening our
Yeah,
businesses.
no kidding. How did you feel the cacao came through in those beers?
I've tried a lot of chocolate beers in my life, and I would say I think that most breweries use raw nibs in their beer. And I think that because I gave them roasted nibs, I literally roasted my nibs and gave them to them the same day.
Hmm.
So they used those fresh roasted peeled nibs in their beer, and it like was so sweet, and like the flavors were so aromatic in it. I might be biased because they're my own beans, but
Right.
it was really, really fragrant. Is just really beautiful. I think that starting with the local brewery has been a blessing for me, but I definitely plan on expanding and seeing what some other breweries can do with my nibs.
Plenty of breweries do use roasted cacao in their beers, but the freshness offered by Sara roasting her nibs the day they're used in a beer certainly must lend a brightness to those chocolate flavors. I hope to try the beers from her partnership with Brighter Days Brewing sometime soon. I thought it was interesting that herbalists tend not to worry much about the variety of hops they're using, and how closely that correlates to the abstract idea of cacao many brewers hold in their minds. It's common to see beer labels that just say cacao or chocolate and don't specify origin, variety, or source. Hopefully, we'll see both of those change as more knowledge is exchanged between these fields. Sara is clearly savvy to the flavors of hops and referenced Citra and Galaxy as favorites. Both are very popular right now, particularly in hazy IPAs, where their tropical fruit aromas are prized. Interestingly, both hops were listed by Eric Parks of Somerville Chocolate as among his favorites for his Hops Dark Milk Bar. You can hear more about that bar and the process behind it in episode 14. Ratza Hopped Citrus is an 80% cacao dark bar made with Criollo and Trinitario cacao from the Moho Valley of Belize, and it's made with orange peel in addition to hop flowers. Where Somerville's hops bar tasted distinctly of hops as we're used to experiencing them in beer, with flavors of sweet orange, tropical fruit, and green tea, this Ratza bar reflects Sara's background in herbal medicine and her emphasis on hops as a natural ingredient from the ground. There's an earthiness and rusticity to the presentation, with a green herbal quality to the hops, and just a whisper of citrus zest and pith from the added orange peel. This is a bar from someone who has had their fingers in the soil and speaks the language of growing things. That awareness is actually how Sara got started with cacao and chocolate making in the first place.
I guess it's really just a snowball effect of life's journey, I guess. So I started studying health and food when I was around 30. So I had just had my son, and the whole food awakening happened to me where I'm like, oh my gosh, they're doing this to our food and they're putting this on our food and this is what's happening to our food. No. And so I started researching foods and how to heal with foods. And my dad had passed a year later from heart disease. So it just kind of all came in on me where I'm like, oh my gosh, I need to help other people. I need to educate myself more on how we can heal with food and things that we're eating that are hurting us. And I quit my job as a teacher to stay at home with my son. And at the same time, kind of fell into a position with my best friend who owned an organic coffee shop. So through her shop, I started working with raw foods, studying more raw foods, working more with coffee, which again, I'm a coffee snob. So starting to learn, more about the production of really good coffee. We were making really good espresso, really good coffee drinks. And chocolate just kind of fit in with what I was doing. So I was making raw chocolates at the time, which I don't do anymore. But it was snowballed to where, oh, okay, so I'm taking cacao powder and coconut oil and we refrigerate this. So how's chocolate really made? And so I started researching and I'm like, oh, it's a paste and a butter and you add these together and you can add flavors. Okay, but how is this made? So it literally kind of snowballed where I was like going backwards from like the powder to the bean.
Sure.
So once I discovered that, oh my gosh, it's a bean, and you take the beans and it turns into a paste, where I really started researching and reading the history and starting to learn more about the culture. And I guess at the same time, I was learning about plants also, and kind of into the whole essential oil thing, which again, I'm not really into anymore. But that opened up my eyes to the medicinal aspects of plants. So learning constituents of, oh, lavender essential oil is good for this and this. Well, actually, lavender plant is the same. After researching the history of cacao, nobody ever had raw cacao. It always had been roasted. So I started roasting my own beans and starting to learn the roasting process, which is super similar to coffee. And I think that experience is what really just blew my mind, where like the flavor, so it's like, oh my gosh, I'm taking this bean and just lightly roasting it is just bringing out like, the astringency, and just like if you roast it a little bit more, you open your oven and all of a sudden it smells like brownies. So I started learning more about herbs and went to herbalism school, and learned a new perspective of the plants also. So we started learning about energetics of plants and how we have warming plants and cooling plants and heating and hot and cold. And I think that really kind of opened up my eyes also to what was happening with cacao on an energetics level. So not only now are we talking about an actual plant that people are harvesting, to, pulling out the seeds and doing this process of this ritual of like the heating, and, cacao is known for fire and passion and opening your heart. And, if you want to get into the whole like heart chakra, like it opens your heart chakra, like whatever, it's a heart opening medicine that involves heat. It just really it fascinates me. So I think that's really kind of my spiral of how I really just found my love for chocolate, and I'm able to incorporate my love for the other plants and the medicinal benefits of the other plants that you're able to integrate into chocolate,
Sure.
which is amazing.
Where do you source your cacao from?
So I use the uncommon cacao, and I mainly only use Central and South American beans, just because it's important for me I believe that the elevation, the rainforest, being in that land is the best for cacao. That's where it's grown originally. I just think it produces the best tasting cacao. I personally just think that it's nice to get beans that are I don't want to say from the indigenous people of where cacao comes from, but I think that there's something special about that region and the cacao that's being produced.
We'll be right back.
Hey everyone, Final Gravity Issue 5 is now available in the shop on beantobarstool.com. This 5th issue of our zine telling personal, human-centered stories from the world of beer is full of great articles. Bano Segudu tells the story of the South African beer style Umkombothi, poignantly explaining its role in her culture and the importance in her family's celebrations and milestones. Maria Krugliak writes about discovering the Portuguese half pint after moving to Portugal during the COVID-19 pandemic. Amanda Bruns and Obakeng Malope discuss the water spirit Mamuhaswa and the collaboration beer they brewed in her honor. These and numerous other stories fill the 56 pages of this zine. We've expanded it and added a few features for this issue. It's full color, full of lots of beautiful photography and art. Definitely check this out. It's on beantobarstool.com/shop. You can purchase this issue or subscribe, and you can always support us on Patreon and get extra perks as well. Cheers. It is easy for consumers to lose sight of both beer and chocolate as agricultural products. We don't have either one without plants, grain and hops in beer, cacao and chocolate, without farmers to grow those plants, and without rural land for them to grow on. These are plant-based agrarian foods, even though mass production has made it easy for us to forget that. You might be sipping a hazy IPA bursting with fruity hop character in a hip tap room in the city, but that beer is as much a testament to farming as it is to brewing. And the same is true for chocolate, something Bean to Bar chocolate makers have done a good job emphasizing as they raise consumer understanding around cacao sourcing and chocolate production. The influence of plants in beer and chocolate, both wild and cultivated, doesn't have to stop with those foundational ingredients, though. Many brewers and chocolate makers are using a range of other fruits and botanicals in their products, and Sara is doing that specifically from the understanding that plants can improve our lives and our health in subtle but direct ways.
So I try to stay as simple with my ingredients as possible because I use really good beans, and I always tell people, why would I want to add anything in my chocolate that's not as good as my bean? It just seems crazy to ruin a chocolate like that.
Do you grow any of the herbs that you use or forage for them or anything like that?
I wish. I am not allowed to. So, and I don't know if that's just from the state of Florida, but we have to technically, if we're purchasing something for our product, it has to be purchased from an actual farm. The one thing I do try to find locally particular is my Florida Roselle, which I am about to get soon because all of the Roselle around here are blooming. And I do have some in my house, and I just don't like it. I'll have to use it for my own personal reasons, but it's everywhere. So I'll just have to find basically a local farmer that's able to cut the Roselle and pass it along to me to use for my bars. But that's one of my favorites. It's coming.
In looking through the bars that you had available on your website, I had to Google a number of ingredients that I just wasn't familiar with. Tell me about, looking at bars like Aphrodite and Self-Love, there's a lot of ingredients there that I'm not familiar with, and I have to assume a lot of people aren't. Tell me about some of those.
So that's part of the fun of what I do. I love being able to educate people on what the ingredients are in those bars. Chocolate is within itself an aphrodisiac, so it makes it really easy to make a bar that is going to help support that part of our body, because we can't say it really does anything. The herbs that are used in the Aphrodite bar are technically to help, a lot of them is with energy level, and it's going to help support our reproductive organs. And a lot of those herbs in the Aphrodite are also Ayurvedic, which makes sense. It's like, oh, that's so funny. Herbs being, aphrodisiacs, that makes sense. So I usually just tell people that the bar is good for everyone. It's not going to be like you're taking a magic pill. Herbs don't work like that. But when I was coming up with the formulation for the Aphrodite specifically, I remember being in my kitchen and mixing herbs in, and I always would lick the spoon and lick the bowl after I was done. And I almost immediately felt this warming effect. And so that's another thing that herbs will do to you, kind of, most foods will give you some sort of effect, whether it's warming or cooling or. So this bar specifically is made to, I would say, like, I felt warm from the inside out. So, I think that is the best description that I personally felt with that bar.
Sure.
And so for the self-love is one of my favorite bars because it has the reishi and chaga mushrooms in it, which what we call immunomodulators, which are going to help support your immune system. So those are just really good bars, really good herbs to have anyway in your diet. It has Eleuthero is Siberian ginseng, which is to help energy level. So I think it also has the ashwagandha in that bar, which is also energy level, helping to support just your basic body functions of every day. And so yeah, it's basically just everybody can have it. I always work with herbs that are going to be everybody friendly. So I always suggest if anybody knows, most people that have certain health ailments will already know kind of like, oh, I can't have that. But for the most part, I always do my research. I go back to my books. I just make sure that there's not going to be any kind of interactions with any kind of medicines or anything. So everybody friendly.
The mushrooms are interesting in particular. I've had a few other chocolates with mushroom, and I've actually had a number of beers brewed with mushroom. And it's an ingredient that in general cooking, we almost always associate with savory foods. But looking at beer and chocolate, you're looking at things that have more sweetness to them. Tell me a little bit about the interaction there and how you make that flavor work with chocolate.
I love mushrooms so much. They, to me, have almost like this, I want to say like meaty, like there's just something about them that's kind of like dark and grounding. Like for some reason, like when I think of mushrooms, I always just think of like really grounding effects. So I don't put enough in that people are going to go like, oh, I taste mushroom. And with reishi and chaga, I don't think necessarily give you, like when you think of like cooking with mushrooms, it's not the same. So I think that it just gives a hint of the flavor. And I think that with all of the herbs that I'm putting in, you don't really specifically notice a lot of the herbs that people aren't sure of anyway. I don't even know if they'd be able to honestly pick them out. But that's what I think about mushroom and chocolate. I think they're a beautiful complement, especially when your sugar content is so low. So if you have a nice high cacao percentage, I think mushrooms are beautiful in chocolate.
What story is your chocolate telling?
So I try to make my chocolate with a lot of love and attention. I think that all food, with the energetics of food, and when you're making food that is like a living thing, I think that the beans themselves are telling a story. I think that's what's so beautiful about craft chocolate that's different from other chocolates on the shelf at a grocery store, is that we find beans that are actually, I feel that are made with love. So bringing that to Tarpon Springs, Florida, or wherever else they go, I feel like I'm educating people through my chocolate. And I've had somebody before tell me that my chocolate was like a journey for their palate. So being able to have all of those different notes coming through at different times. And I want really for people to experience what chocolate really is, and that chocolate isn't milk and sugar, that it actually is this living, it's a seed from a plant. So it's a very, really special thing. I hope to convey that through my chocolate.
Sara's Aphrodite bar is wild. Plenty of chocolate gets marketed as romantic, but those bars don't tend to ask much of us as tasters. They're often sweeter and simpler in their indulgence. They might be quite good, but they usually hold a pretty broad, easy appeal. That's not this bar. Aphrodite tastes of the wild spaces that birthed it. At 80%, it's somewhat bitter, with hints of char, and its botanical ingredients were beyond my experience, opening my imagination to an image of a dark forest glen, plants too untamed for a groomed garden. There is a physicality to this bar that doesn't feel out of place when you think about its purported benefits, a recognition of both dark and light in the natural world. There are a number of breweries working with foraged and locally harvested botanicals, mushrooms, and other plant-based ingredients, and I'll include some of those in future episodes. Scratch Brewing in Ava, Illinois, Fonta Flora Brewing in Morganton, North Carolina, and Earth Eagle Brewings in Portsmouth, New Hampshire come readily to mind, with the owners of Scratch and Earth Eagle each having written books about using wild botanicals in home brewing. Herbalist Stephen Herod Buhner wrote a book in the late 90s called Sacred and Herbal Healing Beers that is still widely referenced. I'll include details of all those books in the show notes. Sara Ratza loves plants. She believes in plants and in their importance in our lives. And fortunately for us, that includes cacao. You can taste that plant love and wisdom in her bars, which can be purchased at ratzachocolate.com. If there's a topic you'd like to see covered in this podcast, drop me a line through social media or at beantobarstool@gmail.com. You can also let me know if you've had good chocolate beers or beer-infused chocolate, and if you come across any you think I would find interesting. Let your friends know about this show if you think they would enjoy it, and you can even share it with your favorite chocolate makers or brewers, and of course, you can leave a review on your preferred listening platform. If you feel inspired to share one of your own beer and chocolate pairings on Instagram, tag the post with the Bean to Barstool hashtag so I can see it and comment. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Bean to Barstool.